Fujitsu's purpose is to build trust in the world through innovation. My contention this morning is that in order to do that, you have to understand how power operates in the world. That as technologists working on quantum computing and the adjacent fields of AI and machine learning, it is a moral and ethical duty on us to imagine what kind of world we might be ushering in and to work backwards to make sure that that is a world fit for human flourishing. To do that, I'm going to make two arguments that directly contradict each other. It's been said that the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and retain the ability to function. I hope that you're all functioning at the end of this talk. The first argument I want to make is that intelligence is a hierarchy, and that has really profound implications. That if we want to succeed as citizens, as companies and countries, we need to do everything we can to ensure that we maximize our collective intelligence of our groups, our organizations. On the other hand, intelligence as it exists in nature is absolutely not a hierarchy. It is nested, interdependent, and inextricable from context. And therefore, if we are to succeed in a world of artificially general intelligence systems and artificially superintelligent systems, we need to reimagine how we value intelligence, how we think about it, and how we define what it is. So on the one hand, intelligence is a hierarchy, and on the other hand, it absolutely isn't. And we have to believe both those things to build the world that we need. Let me start with why intelligence is a hierarchy and why that matters for those of us working on quantum computing. On this slide, you see how every major breakthrough in AI and machine learning over the last decade has been driven by increases in computational power. You can see how the success of large language models in the last year or so has been driven by a 3 times higher increase in computational power. Yes, some algorithmic innovation in things like transformer models and attention, but principally by massive increases in computational power. At the same time, supercomputing has gone to exascale compute. This slide, the 4 highest dots on this are all Fujitsu's Fugaku, the world's fastest supercomputer, still on the graph 500, albeit now overtaken by Frontier on the top 500. That matters if you work in quantum computing because a 100-qubit quantum computer would be more powerful than all of the current supercomputers combined. So if every major breakthrough in machine learning and AI has been driven by increases in computational power, what does it mean when we have that kind of increase through the application of quantum to AI/ML algorithms? And it's worth remembering that a 101-qubit quantum computer is not 1% faster, but 100% faster than a 100-qubit quantum computer. We are on the brink of delivering computational power beyond most people's imagination. And it's not in the far distance. Those last 3 bullets there tell you quantum computers that already exist, 2 of which we are involved in building. One is ours in Japan. Sesca is one that we're building with Oxford Quantum Circuits in Spain. So the point here is that what we're seeing with the application of ever greater compute in AI and machine learning is, yes, linear increases in the performance of the models that we build. The top 3 charts you see on that slide show that how, as we increase compute, so we get more accurate models. As we increase data size, so we get more accurate models. As we get parameters, so we get more accurate or more capable models. But on the bottom, what you see is that we also get phase shifts. We get models that suddenly do things that we did not know they could do before. That if you just looked at what they had done previously, they would be incapable of doing. And then suddenly, with increased compute, they do things we didn't expect. In this case, it talks about arithmetic, intelligent process automation, transliteration, word unscrambling, Persian question and answering. But they're just examples. There are a number of these phase shifts, things we didn't know they would do that suddenly they can. So what? Think back to the last slide. What does it mean when we apply that kind of computational power to these kinds of models? I think you're going to see phase shifts on a scale that we can't begin to imagine, and I think it's ethically and morally incumbent upon us to make sure we build the kind of world in which humans can flourish, therefore. We're also moving further away on which reliance on human supervision to align models, to get them to act in ways that we would want them to act, is diminishing. Reinforcement learning with AI feedback, introduced in a paper in December 2022, means that we're increasingly relying on an AI self-supervising approach to alignment. So that is, if you like, AIs supervising other AIs to make sure they act in ways that humans want them to. Why does that matter? Well, in 1997, a guy called Hans Moravec wrote a paper called When Will Computing Power Exceed the Human Brain? Hans Moravec is a computer scientist now at Carnegie Mellon University. And he introduced this idea of the landscape of human competence, where he described hierarchically those things that were human capabilities, with some things in the high distant mountains, and those things, the rising tide of AI was the sea, slowly subsuming human capabilities with machine capabilities. In 2018, the MIT physicist Max Tegmark produced that image, but in graphical form, and he showed, you can see here a replication of it, that the sea had already subsumed quite a lot. The rising tide of AI capabilities had already subsumed a lot of things we once thought unique to human intelligence. Since I started using this graphic in 2018, those things in the mountains and the hills that were once thought far distant now have machine learning capabilities lapping up against them. Book writing and AI design with Copilot and large language models are two very obvious examples, so too art and cinematography. So if we think of intelligence as a hierarchy, we are no longer as clearly distinguished at the top of it in a whole raft and a growing number of domains. We also have a world in which the hardware on which AI runs is increasingly designed by AI. Every major semiconductor company uses AI to do the chip floor planning to maximize the performance of its AI models when it runs on them. So not only is AI now trying to design the systems which protect it from acting out of alignment with what we want it to do, it's also building the hardware on which it runs. Why does that matter? Well, when we wrote the UK's international strategy in number 10, we had one fundamental premise that overlay it. That was the idea that automation, robotics, and AI reduce nations' dependence on people to create wealth and to scale armed forces to deter and fight. When you think of that in terms of companies, it means that companies are less dependent on their workers to create wealth. And what you see on the left-hand chart is how since 1980, there has been a 70% decrease adjusting for inflation in the number of workers needed to generate $1 million in revenue for companies on the S&P 500. What does it mean when we have the kind of intelligence that will be generated by quantum computation acting on AI and ML or quantum AI and ML models? On the right-hand side, you can see the continuing reduction in cost to train an AI system. In the next 12 months, we expect that to fall even further with the introduction of processors, some of which we build and some of which our competitors build. So that chart on the left, I would suggest, is likely to see a continued decrease in the number of workers needed, and even more so when we introduce quantum. So intelligence is a hierarchy. What we see here is a quantum timeline. I'm not going to try and talk through all of this. It's just the last 12 months. I think what you see here is we are beginning to shift in some domains towards applications of quantum. This is the first one that I highlight is Phasecraft, a Bristol University spin-out, applying quantum computers to model electronic and magnetic properties of electronic systems to design new hardware. We see Rolls-Royce announcing work on quantum algorithm design. If we go along, we see our partners, HSBC, beginning exploring real-world application of true quantum computing, not just annealing and combinatorics, in banking. And they're doing that both with us and with others. So in summary, I think we're seeing progress on all fronts for hardware, but little convergence as to which system will get there, but multiple progress towards a true quantum computer. We're seeing a shift to practical applications. It's not just an explosion in computational power you get with quantum, but a fundamentally new way of modeling the world, of modeling processes, systems, and things. And at the same time, we're seeing a shift towards the development of algorithms and software. You can see in the bottom right-hand side, as you look at it, the number of quantum algorithm papers being produced in the world. And that in 2023, we've already exceeded the baseline that goes back to 2014, so we're likely to see a further increase this year. So what? Well, for us as technologists in the UK, whether you're working on AI/ML or whether you're working on quantum, it's particularly relevant. Forbes magazine has said that Cambridge is to quantum computing what Silicon Valley was to classical computing. That puts a particular responsibility on us to imagine what this future looks like and to work backwards to make sure that the one we introduce to the world is one fit for human flourishing. It's a massive opportunity. It's also a risk. Where are we in terms of some of these things? I'm talking about weak artificial general intelligence and strong. Well, the best way of understanding the future and predicting the future is to rely on super forecasters. Currently, their medium estimate for artificial general intelligence, a weak one that passes all benchmarks, is 2026. Their argument and forecast for artificial general intelligence, including robotics, is 2032, and the argument for when we get, or prediction for when we get artificial superintelligence is 4.3 years later. The point being, all within our lifetimes. That's why people are beginning to talk about existential risk from AI. What does it mean when we're no longer at the top of that hierarchy of intelligence that I described? Something that quantum computing could accelerate significantly. And in worrying about the short-term problems, I think we're ignoring sometimes that the longer-term challenges this will introduce. The tiger's on there because one analogy is used is that the tiger isn't in the cage because it doesn't have better weapons than humans. It's not in the cage because it's not stronger than us. It's in the cage because it's not smarter than us. So what does it mean when a super intelligent machine is at the top of that hierarchy? So I would suggest that intelligence is a hierarchy. We should be excited, despite what I put on this slide, about the opportunities that this offers, but we're also right to be afraid. I like Edgar Gister's take on this, which is the question of whether a computer can think is no more interesting than the question of whether a submarine can swim. If it can outperform us on multiple benchmarks, that's what matters, and it seems likely that it's going to continue to do so with the development of quantum algorithms and quantum applications to further accelerate our progress in AI and machine learning. At the same time, I want to make an equal and opposite argument. Sam Altman, talking in India last week, Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, was responding to a question, and he said, I grew up implicitly thinking that intelligence was this really special human thing, somewhat magical, but now I think it's sort of a fundamental property of matter. And he said that the history of scientific discovery is that humans are less and less at the center. Now, I think what Sam has in mind there is the idea that we're being pushed down the hierarchy by artificial intelligence. But for me, I think if we think of AI or intelligence as a fundamental property of nature, we draw a very different conclusion about what the future might look like. To make that argument, let me first say that I think whilst the human brain has both global and local processing, it's the left-hand side of the brain in which language resides. And I think our large language models are built on a way of seeing that is principally left brain dominated. The left brain abstracts, it categorizes, it freezes in time, it fragments, and it applies logic, if, then, else. Sound familiar? It also confabulates. It makes up with enormous confidence things that it doesn't understand in order to cover the gaps in our logic. Confabulation is a neuroscientific psychological idea that we now use to describe some of the things large language models do. In contrast, the seat of understanding in the brain is the right-hand side of the brain, which is silent. If you cut the corpus callosum, the right-hand side of the brain can only communicate through the left hand. We have contralateral connections in the brain. And so you can see that we now know it has a very fundamentally different worldview. The aha moment of insight when humans deliver breakthroughs is usually the recognition that there's something not quite right in our assumptions. That's a right brain, not a left brain process. It's something, therefore, that I think large language models can't do. If you want a mathematical interpretation of what I'm talking about, we're approaching Gödel's theorem here that argues that no matter how good the algorithm or how much computation that you apply, there are some things that are not amenable to mathematics that will never be resolved through mathematics. We're also applying Mandelbrot's idea, the idea of Mandelbrot sets, which is the idea that there are some levels of complexity that you can never extract, that in the end, the world is inextricable, contextual. You can't separate it out purely into logic because everything is connected to everything else and everything affects everything else. The more that you measure, the more that you try to objectify and separate as the left brain does, the more you get ever greater complexity. So we have two fundamental ways of seeing, and I think our AI is designed around the former. And I think that points to a way of reimagining the world in which the human continues to have an important role within a kind of collective intelligence ecosystem. Intelligence is also not a hierarchy, but a way of being. So even within our own brain, neuroscientists would tell you that we have multiple oppositional processes going on all the time. Our brains are in constant dialogue. We are not one intelligence, but the amalgamation of many intelligences in one head. It's also true that at a social level, there are a great number of things that humans don't know they know, things that have evolved in culture as traditions, as habits, that we then go on to operate. One example is the way we use herbs in foods. Very few people know, and most societies didn't know, that you can cook, say, onions and garlic, and they don't lose their microbial properties. Whereas the herbs we put in last in food would lose their microbial properties if we put them in first. It's a very recent discovery, and yet we all cook in a certain order. We have evolved preferences. We have a cultural understanding, a collective intelligence understanding. We don't know things, and yet they're really important to our survival. If you look not just at the multiple intelligences within our own head, but in organisms like the octopus, most of its neurons are not in its head, but in its arms, which can continue to problem solve even if severed from the body. It is many intelligences, a profoundly alien intelligence, and therefore a useful analogy for thinking about how intelligence operates in the world, not as a unitary whole, but as an ecosystem. And lastly, and perhaps most astonishingly, if we look to discoveries going back to 1997 about the Wood Wide Web, this is the discovery that trees and forests are connected by mycorrhizal fungi that allow them to exchange sugar and water through that network with other trees. It allows the mycorrhizal fungi in turn supplies nitrogen. That doesn't sound that surprising. But what it tells you is that everything is connected to everything else. What it also tells you is that when one tree in a forest is attacked by a parasite or a disease, it communicates via that network with every other tree. that then makes a decision, which we would describe as cognition in humans or other animals. It makes a decision in the other trees that they will then release their immune system to protect themselves. What we also learn through studies of the wood wide web and mycorrhizal fungi is that some trees will preferentially feed their own offspring over others, will help those trees that are diseased. What are we learning here? We're learning that intelligence is in everything, just as Sam Altman said. We're learning that intelligence is nested. It's not a hierarchy. Intelligence, as we're describing it here, one isn't better than another. It's all dependent on everything else, and it's inextricable. So my suggestion is we've been misled by a way of seeing that is driven by the left brain, and by misunderstanding intelligence as a hierarchy rather than a way of being, a way of operating in the world. If that's true, we need to be thinking, what does that mean for organizational transformation? Back down to earth. So in the US, after Garry Kasparov lost at chess, they began talking about how we needed centaur organizations modeled on centaur chess. So in 1997, Garry Kasparov loses at chess, and then after that, what they find is that the human and the machine playing together against a computer, the human and machine consistently win. So they made this analogy with a centaur. They said, well, the human head is directing the brute force computation of the non-human body. That's not true anymore. Centaur chess is for the birds. The computer beats the human computer playing together. Our wetware is the limit on the hardware. So in the US now, they're starting to talk about building minotaur organizations. A recent paper from the US Army War College argues that, look at Amazon warehouses. It's a non-human head that's directing the hands to do what it wants. So humans are now reduced to a subordinate role. Do we need minotaur organizations? Do our leaders and CEOs, will they be more effectively replaced by an artificial superintelligent AI? Well, they will be if we think of intelligence as a hierarchy. I think a more useful classical image is the idea of Gaia. Gaia was the goddess of nature. James Lovelock's idea of Gaia is that everything is connected to everything else. There isn't a hierarchy of intelligence. One form isn't better than another. And therefore, what we're beginning to think is, how do we develop power with machines? Not them over us, or us over them, but power with machines in which everything is connected to everything else, and we maximize the collective intelligence of our organizations. That idea of an ecology of intelligence, an ecosystem of intelligence, is what motivates us at the Centre for Cognitive and Advanced Technologies. We are trying to think about what it means to be humans, to be nodes in a wider intelligence network. How do we maximize the performance of your organizations? How do we reimagine organizational design for the 21st century when we know what's coming? Rather than starting with solving short-term problems, how do we fix the long-term problems? So we have a collective intelligence program that focuses on humans and machines thinking together. We're trying to develop new ways of seeing, understanding the interconnections, using quantum computing to model the world in new ways, using a fusion cell to model information and understand data in new ways, and looking at digital twins to instantiate the spatial internet, to understand how we will interact with information in new ways. And lastly, thinking of new ways of being, reappraising the nature and value of intelligence, developing neurosymbolic AI, so superhuman performance with explainability, looking at how we can benchmark combinatoric solutions to complement AI to develop new solutions, and recognizing that we can't build this ecosystem on our own, partnering with organizations who can help build this future. If this sounds as exciting to you as it does to me and you want to work with us, email us at Centre for Cognitive and Advanced Tech at Fujitsu.com, described as you see on the slide, so cognitive and advanced tech at Fujitsu.com, and get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith.
Thanks, Barry.
We've just got time for one or two questions from the audience. Has anyone got anything to ask Keith?
Okay.
Hi.
So my question is really around how you control this. As you say, quantum computing is getting to be the point whereby surely it's beyond our ability as a two-legged biped ape to understand. Same with AI, whereby we're at the point whereby if we program AI, it arrives with our bias because we're trying to train it to, I think, like a human being, whereas actually you want it to be trained to be kind of apart from that. Therefore, you're training it in AIs to train AIs. Yeah. The thing I always get struck by is kind of back to Asimov's hierarchy, whereby the positronic brain idea, you can't implement that positronic brain, I take it, because it's now in software. So how do you create it? Do you have to create an AI which creates the ethical side of the brain to these AIs? How do you put some, I don't want to say hobbling or some limiting factor to them, so that they can't go, because eventually you get to the point where they can't explain things to us, and they may take paths which are totally logical to them, which we are no longer even aware of.
Yeah,
We have no audit of them, I guess.
So there's not a simple answer to a question as complex as that, but I'll try and give a short one. So I think one of the reasons we're pursuing neurosymbolic AI is because you need the superhuman performance with explainability. Otherwise, we won't be able to interact with these kinds of entities. I think the other thing to think about is those right brain processes. You know, we know a lot of facts about the brain, but we don't know how the brain works as a whole. Everything I've said is open to a certain amount of contest, and the point being there that right brain processes, understanding, is something that right now we can't model, and we may not be able to model in computation, and that suggests a continued role for humans within that ecosystem in delivering the kind of comprehensive understanding. Now, maybe we can. Maybe you can instantiate all this in computation. I don't know. But for now, I think that begins to preserve the role of the human, but in a much wider network of collective intelligence to get the maximum out of us all. So it's a slightly short answer, but yeah, begins to approach the problem.
Thank you. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much, Keith.
All right. Thanks, Barry.
Have a round of applause for Keith, please.
Thanks, everyone.